Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today we'll be discussing the process of cellular respiration, which at its basic form is how you convert the food you eat into usable energy for your cells. Here is the basic formula for cellular respiration. Glucose plus oxygen goes to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. If it looks familiar, that's because it is. It's chemically speaking the exact opposite of photosynthesis. And in this process, eukaryotic cells, both animals and plant cells, can break down sugars to make chemical energy for their cells. Um, some things you need to know before we get started. There are these two molecules, NADH and FADH2. Um, they work similar to the molecules ATP and NADPH that we discussed in photosynthesis, where they trap electrons and store energy to be used for later. So cellular respiration takes place in two different parts of the cell. The first step, glycolysis, occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, while the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain take place in the mitochondria. So here's what the mitochondria looks like. Um, you've all probably heard before, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Um, that's because this is where all of the ATP is made inside of your cells, right? It is a double membraned organelle, just like the chloroplast. It has its own DNA, just like a chloroplast. Um, it's got an inner fluid inside. That's called the matrix. And then the two membranes are called the inner membrane and the outer membrane. Um, Again, glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm, while the different steps, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, happen inside the mitochondria here. So, cellular respiration is a little complicated. The things you need to know here, I'll take you through it. First is the basic formula. If you knew photosynthesis formula, this is just the exact opposite. Glucose plus oxygen go to make um, go to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. You also need to know the three basic steps. You can see them here: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Know the general amount of ATP made in each step, right? So glycolysis nets 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle nets 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain nets somewhere between 28 to 34 ATP. Um, we'll talk about specific numbers a different date, but um, each molecule of glucose broken down can net you somewhere between 32 to 38 molecules of ATP. And then understand where the reactions take place. Glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. The Krebs cycle happens in the matrix, while the electron transport chain happens on the inner mitochondrial membrane. So let's go through each step. The first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis. Um, the whole point of glycolysis is to start the process of breaking down glucose. So if you follow this diagram just down, glycolysis requires you to put in a little bit of ATP, right? So it needs two ATP molecules. But in this process of breaking apart glucose, you get four ATP molecules for a net of of two ATP molecules. And in this process, you break apart glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule, into two 3-carbon molecules called pyruvic acids or pyruvate. Um, this pyruvate is needed for the next step of cellular respiration. And again, this step happens outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. If there is oxygen available, the next step of cellular respiration would be to do the Krebs cycle, which is also known as the citric acid cycle. Um, if oxygen isn't present, that's a different situation, and we'll talk about that on a different day. This citric acid or Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. What goes in is known as acetyl coenzyme A, which is what is made after converting that pyruvate molecule. You don't need to know how or why it's converted. But what comes out is important. What comes out is high energy molecules like ATP, and then FADH2 and NADH. These are the things we talked about just a few minutes ago. These FADH2 and NADH molecules carry electrons, carry energy to the last part of cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is the byproduct of this reaction because in this reaction, what's basically happening is you're breaking apart those three carbon molecules at every step. Break it apart little by little. And every time you break it apart, you can release a little bit of carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Right? You're breaking the chemical bonds, releasing the energy, and capturing that energy in NADH and FADH2. Then the final step is known as the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain happens on the inner mitochondrial membrane, and this is where NADH and FADH2, the energy and the electrons stored in there, can be transferred to the electron transport chain to make ATP. You don't need to know the fine details of this little chart you see here, but basically know what happens is the energy from NADH and FADH2 is used to make a concentration gradient, where one side of the membrane is more concentrated than the other side. Then, when they build up enough of a concentration gradient, it releases all of that stored up energy and all of these stored up ions through this molecule called ATP synthase. And while those ions are directed through ATP synthase, it gives this enzyme enough energy to convert ADP, which is the less energetic form of ATP, into ATP. So you convert ATP in this process by running the concentration gradient through this ATP synthase, which is an enzyme that makes ATP. This only happens if oxygen is present. If you can recognize down here, oxygen is present as the electron and hydrogen acceptor. It accepts the electrons, accepts the hydrogen ions, and turns that oxygen into water. If this isn't present, this reaction does not happen. So this is our summary of cellular respiration. You should be able to look at this and understand it based on what we just talked about. First step here is called glycolysis. Glucose is broken down. You get two ATP molecules. Pyruvate is made, and that eventually gets turned into acetyl coenzyme A. That is used and broken down in the Krebs cycle. Oxygen is used up a little bit, and then you make these two molecules, FADH2 and NADH. During this part of the reaction, you make two ATP molecules and carbon dioxide. And then finally, in the inner mitochondrial membrane, oxygen is used in the electron transport chain along with FADH2 and NADH to net you 32 ATP molecules and water. Um, the one thing to note as we finish up our talk about cellular respiration here is the interconnectedness of their reactions, right? Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the air and you can use it to convert and make these high energy carrying glucose molecules. Well, cellular respiration does the opposite. You can take the glucose molecules along with the oxygen that was a byproduct of photosynthesis, break those down, make energy, release carbon dioxide and water, which are used for photosynthesis. They're connected processes, and it is a relatively balanced cycle without input from other outside sources. That is known as the basis of the carbon cycle, which we will spend much more detail on in our next unit about ecology. Carbon cycle, some of the basis, right? Photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the backbone there. Thank you for watching. I suggest watching this again if you find yourself confused or need a review.